we have our pinch pot pinched out at this point, and it's moved into the leather hard stage, so it's still in the early parts of the leather hard stage, so this is still movable a little bit, but it should be, you know, relatively smooth. We really shouldn't see any kind of fingerprint marks or crumbs or anything like that. And at this point, we're going to go ahead and put some feet on the bottom of our pinch pot. So now that you understand, the other thing I want to kind of mention is now that you understand the pinch potting process, if you were to make another one of these, you know, now you can get a little bit more clever with the shape and the design and what you're going to add to it. But it was just really important that you understood how to make a proper pinch pot before you know, go into the artistic mode of changing the shape and altering and doing different things that you could do to the surface of this. For us, and the purpose of this video, we are only going to add some feet to the foot. So I've got some options drawn out for you. These are going to be the most basic and simplest forms. So they go from, you know, relatively simple, these two up here, to a little bit more advanced if you're just beginning with ceramics. So if your comfort level, if you're still a little uneven, you know, maybe stay away from this one and pick from the top two. So this is just going to be a coil that we add to the base of your pinch pot, so the foot of the pinch pot. This one is going to be 3 separate pieces that we add to the foot. And then finally, this has a little bit more pizzazz going on here. It starts as a coil, and then we roll up the end. And then when we attach it, we're going to kind of attach it to the side of the pinch pot. So like I said, this one's a little bit more advanced. So if you're feeling like, oh, I just want my pinch pot to be successful, and understand how to make a proper attachment, because that's really what we're going for, then maybe stay with one of these up here. I'm going to start with this one, and then I'll work my way down. So I have my pitch pot, and what we want to do is we want to put our foot, or the attachment that we're adding right here on the foot, kind of near the curve. So we're not going to be right on it. We're going to be just slightly in. And so if you need to, it might help to kind of just draw yourself a little guide. If you have a circle stencil, that is even helpful. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it here. So I'm not right here on the curve of the pinch pot, I'm just slightly in, and I tried to make this evenly spaced all the way around. So that tells us where my attachment mark is going to be. So I'm going to set this aside for just a little bit. I'm going to break off a chunk of my clay. I don't need much for this. Probably don't even need that much. Cut that in half. And I'm going to make a coil. Now to make a proper coil, we'll learn in depth, you know, really how to make a coil pot, I guess, later. But this is kind of a down and dirty way to make a coil. But I had it in a little bit of a cube, or even if you have a clump, not that big of a deal, but I'm just kind of pinching out this coil. So a coil is just a long, round piece of clay, kind of looks like a snake. But I'm just kind of, to get it started, because it was in a cube, I'm just kind of gently pinching, you know, with even pressure in areas that kind of are thicker than others. So kind of using my pinch potting skills. So then once I have it relatively level all the way around, then I'm going to put it in my palm, and I'm going to squeeze and then rotate, squeeze and then rotate. So I'm using like my fingertips and this area of my hand. So I'm not way down here and squeezing. And notice that when I'm rotating this, I'm rotating it just ever so slightly. It's barely, just like when you pinch pot, you rotate just real slight. Same thing when you're making a coil. So that ensures it from becoming uneven. So you can switch directions too. You know, you can flip the coil back and forth. Every now and again, stop and check for an area that might be a little bit thicker. So like right in here, it's a little bit thicker. Kind of starts to look like a pickle sometimes if it's thicker in the middle. Okay, so I have a pretty decent coil started, but this is still really thick. This is the thickness of my thumb, and I want to get it to the thickness of my pinky. So I've got a little bit to go. So I'm going to keep pinching. And you may end up with a coil that's too long for the foot of your pinch pot. That's no big deal because we can trim that. So once I've pinched this out, I'm going to stop, check for some thin areas, get those leveled out. And if I can't pinch anymore, so I have this in my fingertips, I'm rotating the clay, and make sure that you let go as you rotate, because if you keep squeezing as you rotate, you're going to tear the coil. So be sure to let go, even though it doesn't look like I am releasing the clay. So I can't keep squeezing because I can't get this any smaller by doing this technique. So instead, I'm going to put it on my table, and I'm going to spray my table with some water, because the dust from my table is going to get collected in my coil, and it will dry it out. And we want to keep this relatively moist for the attachment process. So I'm just spraying the area where the coil is going to be rolled. So I'm going to place it on my table, and then when I roll this, I'm going to roll from my fingertips to the heel of my hand. And then for beginners, you might want to bring your coil back and just repeat the process. And I'm not pressing down. The weight of my hands is enough to thin this coil out. But do notice that my fingers are kind of spreading open as I do kind of rotate this clay. You don't want to do this because then your coil is going to go flat and it will be uneven. So make sure you start at your fingertips and go to the heel of your hand, and you just kind of work your way out. And you just keep repeating that process until you get your coil to the thickness that you want. But like I said, if you're struggling with that, or it feels like it's going into a rectangle, just pick it up and you can kind of reshape it. But most of the time, if you get a rectangle coil, it's because you were doing this. So that's why sometimes it's best if beginners start in the middle, roll to the heel of their hand, pick the coil up, and bring it back. So I'm going to compare this to my thumb. It's smaller than my thumb, slightly bigger than my pinky. So I'm just going to do one more roll, and then we're going to call this good. Now this little crack right here that's kind of started to happen, I can smooth that out later. I'm not super worried about it. If it was a really deep crack, then we would want to probably just remake this coil, but that'll be just fine. So now I'm going to go back to my pinch pot, and I am going to use my slip, and slip is the glue of the ceramic world. So I have my circle where I'm going to apply my coil. So I'm going to take my slip and I'm going to put it right on top of that line that I drew, and then I'm going to put some on my coil as well. So whenever you have two pieces of clay that you're attaching, you always score and you slip. So right now I just put the slip, and now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to score where I had that circle. So if you lost that circle, obviously because of your slip, you can just kind of mockily draw it back on there. Just like that. And then you're going to take your needle tool and we're going to do some scoring marks. It also kind of looks like crosshatch if you have taken a drawing class. But I'm going into the clay and I'm scratching the surface. And you want to go in a couple different directions. It's going to look really messy. Don't worry about that. We'll clean that up later. But notice how close I'm making the scoring marks together. If you don't do that and you just kind of randomly put them on there and space them out, then this scoring, this texture, isn't going to do anything. So you don't necessarily need to score the coil, but I would put some slip on it. And then you're going to put it right on that line where you've scored. And then I like to overlap the coil just slightly, like so. And then I'm going to cut it at an angle. And by cutting it at an angle, I will have my coil that meets up pretty perfectly, except it moved when I cut that, so I'm going to recut it. You got to make sure you hold it. I wasn't holding it. There we go. So now we have a foot that meets up just right. So we're not quite done. So it's on there pretty good because of the moisture level of our clay, and we scored and slipped it. But now our next step is to actually attach it. Do you see this seam right here? We want to cover that up. So you can do one of two things. You can just use your fingertip and supporting the opposite side of the coil, you can just pull the clay down. But notice I'm trying to keep it level. So however much clay I pull down here, I'm going to pull the same amount of clay here, 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 and all the way around. You can also use your thumb. I like to kind of smooth as I go when it's a small of an area because it helps me keep this thickness correct. If that doesn't work for you, you can use what we call a modeling tool. But it's the same process. You want to hold the coil on the opposite wall, and you're just using this modeling tool as an extension of your fingertip. Just be careful if you're going to use one of these that you're not gouging the clay so much that your foot is now becoming uneven. So as I pulled that clay wall, I tried to keep it relatively the same as, at the top. So it takes practice. So either your fingertip, your thumb, or your modeling tool. And then once you get back to where you've started, you have to go back in and you have to smooth this out. And notice where the two pieces come together, I'm also smoothing that. I like to use my fingertips for this part, but you certainly could use your modeling tool. Just make sure you support the opposite wall. So that's a pretty common theme in ceramics. Whatever side you're working on, if it has two sides, make sure you're always supporting the opposite, or else you'll stretch that clay. And clay has memory, believe it or not, and it likes to stay in whatever kind of direction you push it. So now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to check for any areas that maybe I took too much clay away from, and I'm just going to do that additive process. And I do like to use a modeling tool when I do the additive process in these small areas. It just makes it easier because you don't have a lot of clay to grip. It's kind of hard to do with your fingertips. So I'm going to keep doing that until I feel like it's even. And for the additive process, you don't need to score and slip. That's a pretty common question, but you don't need to. Just make sure the clay is compressed all the way, or else you're causing an air pocket. Okay, so now this type of foot with a single coil is pretty much finished. We're going to leave it on its rim so this can set up, and then in a little while, or tomorrow, whichever is best for you, you'll come back and you'll just continue to smooth this a little bit with your sponge or a paintbrush. And then we'll put it on its actual foot. We don't want to do that right now because that clay is pretty soft and we don't want it to smush it. So once you feel like you've got that smoothed out on the inside, your next step, of course, is to take your sponge and smooth it out. So I'm just kind of supporting and smoothing. I'm going to go ahead and do the sides of my little coil. I'm not pressing on this. I'm literally just smoothing it out with my sponge, so no pressure. And then one of the final things I like to do is I like to take my slip brush that I was using. I like to spray it with some water, spray the pinch pot itself, and then go back through where the seam is on the outside edge, because we don't need to smooth that in because we want to leave this kind of separation. And sometimes you do have to press it down if you feel like there's too big of a gap. Just be careful when you do that. If you do want to kind of press it just a little bit, make sure you do it from the inside. I wouldn't do it from the rim necessarily, but I'm just pressing down from the inside. And that will help it as well. And it will help level out the foot, which we were going to do later, but you can do it at this step. And there you go. This foot is attached. It's not going anywhere. We're going to let this set up, and then we'll come back and we'll check it out after it's dried for a little bit. So we're going to put that one aside. For your next pinch pot, I guess, choice that would be really good for a beginner is to take a small chunk of clay and divide it into 3 sections, maybe like the size of a nickel. So 3 equal parts. So you might have to, I would probably put them into, just a ball of clay. It doesn't have to be perfect or anything. But try to get about the same amount, and you could weigh it out too, but with just this small amount, you don't really need to. Plus, I don't think it would even register with our scale. So now I've got 3 relatively, I I guess, the same amount of clay here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shape this into a ball. And I'm just using my fingertips to kind of do that. And you could, make it into a cube and then press the corners in. You could do that as well. For this small amount of clay, you can put it in your palm and rotate it. But make sure that you keep it in your palm. See where it's wet? Because if you come way out here, you're going to get more of an oval shape. See how it's kind of looks almost like a diamond? So if that happens, just kind of press down on the top. So I'm pressing down on the top just slightly and then in the middle so I get more of a round shape. So I'm going to do that to all of these pieces. So then just compare them and make sure that they're relatively the same. So at this point, we don't want to add just these balls of clay to the bottom of our pinch pot because they won't be very sturdy. So instead, we're just going to flatten these just slightly. And we're going to do that after we actually attach them to our pinch pot, just so we can kind of compare the sizes once they're attached and we know where we're going to place our next one. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my pinch pot. So here's the foot of my pinch pot. I'm going to place these where I think that I want them. It kind of looks like a smiley face. I'm going to put them a little bit closer together. And keep in mind, you're going to be pushing these down, so that could either determine that you need them further apart or you need them further together. And if you feel like they're too big, you can always start these again. That is no big deal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark where these are. And then I'm going to do the exact same process I did last time. So wherever two pieces of clay touch, I am going to score and slip. And I'm just going to kind of twist it a little bit so it stays. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over, and if you scored and slipped properly, these should not be falling off. You should be just fine. So I'm going to flip this over, and then from the top, I'm going to real gently kind of press with the same amount of pressure, just kind of around the pinch pot with my thumb. You could also use your sponge if you want to, if that helps you get a level. But I'm pressing down. And it will flatten out the feet of your pinch pot. So I don't really like how close this one is, so I'm just going to gently kind of move this a little bit. Oh, it's so stuck on there because I scored and slipped properly that I'm struggling to move it a little bit. And there we go. Now, right now it's looking a little boring. So I'm going to jazz this up. Even though you're probably not going to look at the bottom of your pinch pot very often, we still want to make it look appealing. So instead of leaving it just like this, I'm going to take the handle end of my needle tool. I'm going to find the center, and I'm going to just kind of push that clay down in there so it looks like this. And then I'm just going to wiggle it, but notice that I'm supporting the outside edge, right? So if I wouldn't have been supporting that, then that would have probably pushed this off of there and made all of this become really uneven. So I'm going to do the same thing to the rest of these. Find the center and then support as you rotate. So it's pushing that clay out. This one always makes me laugh because it looks like a face until you get this third one done. Then it kind of looks like a mouth. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to smooth this out. just like we did with our coil, except this time we've got 3 little sections that we're going to smooth at this bottom edge. And then same with the other one. We're going to let this dry a little bit before we put pressure on it or we add any additional designs, because this clay is too wet to do any kind of carvings, because that's always the next question. Can I carve into the feet of my pinch pot? You can, but you need to wait until the right stage. And right now your clay is way too wet. It's got way too much moisture in there. So we're going to set this off to the side with our other pinch pot and let that dry up. We're going to go on to the final foot that you can choose from. So for this third option, I'm going to make one long coil, and I'm going to leave it about the thickness of my thumb, so I'm not going to thin it out to my pinky size. So I'm going to leave my coil about the size of my thumb. It's going to make this just a little bit smoother and thinner. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this into 3 equal sizes. And if you want a measurement for how long I'm making this, 2 inches. So you could just use a ruler on all of them if you wanted. And you might want to keep this extra piece just in case you mess up. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this coil and I'm going to taper it. So I'm going to make it smaller at one end than it is the other. So it's going to be thicker down here than it is up here. So I'm just kind of rotating and pinching with my fingertips. Trying to keep this all, the same thickness even though it's tapered. And you can even roll it if you want, but just make sure you're only rolling the one end. So sometimes I'll use like this part of my hand. Okay, so now we have something like this. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make the other 2 so that way I can compare them to this one. So they're about the same. It is handmade, so it doesn't have to be necessarily perfect, but because of what we're trying to achieve and understand clay thickness and technique, we want to try to get it as close as possible. Once you understand the basics and you understand the techniques, then you can kind of get more into personal style and interpretation and all of that kind of stuff. But it's really important to understand the basics first. So those are all relatively about the same. So now at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to gently press down on just the tip of this coil. So just the tip of it. So I'm just thinning it out so you'll get something like this. And I'm going to do that to all of these. And you might want to keep this one next to it so you know kind of how far up you went and about how thick you made it. And after a while, if you've made a bunch of these, you'll just know. You'll just know because you're pressing out the clay so often. You know exactly how much pressure to apply and where to stop and all that good stuff. But that comes over time. That's not something that will occur right off the bat. So stay with it. If this doesn't work right away, but you really like the way that these look, give it another shot. Okay, so I'm going to spray these because they've gotten, just a little bit dry as we went through the building process. So now at this point, you could pinch this out if you wanted this to be more of like a square leg. I want to keep it round. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the end of this and I am going to roll it up. I actually wish I would have made that. I'm going to roll this back out. Because it didn't roll as long as I thought it would, so I'm going to pinch out a little bit more of this. because I want the focal point of the foot to be the part that's going to be swirled up. There we go, that's better. And so then this will be the foot itself, so it'll go on the pot like so. So this will be attached. So I'm just pinching these out just a little bit more because that first one, when I tried it, there just wasn't enough of a swirl there, so I wanted to add just a little bit more to give it a little bit more interest. So now what we have, all three of our pieces to our feet. They look about the same. They're about the same height, and now we're ready to attach them. So just like with our little circle pieces, I'm going to go ahead and kind of mockly put these on my pinch pot to try to get the spacing about right, because if you have these way over here, then your pot is going to fall over. So could you make more of these and attach them? Sure, absolutely, but I just only wanted to do 3. This pot is too big to only do 2 in the middle. The other thing you could do with this is you could put this right in the middle like so, and it would be fine. You wouldn't want to put it on the weight of that until it has dried up a little bit though. But for beginners, I probably wouldn't recommend that because you do have to get it pretty perfect. So I'm going to put it off to the side like this. I think that is a good fit. But I want these pieces to come over the side just a little bit. So now I'm going to take my thumb and I'm going to press ever so slightly so I have an angle. So it's kind of flattening the top of this, but that's okay. But I have this angled edge right here now. And then I'm going to go back in, I'm going to smooth that out if I need to. And that is going to be where I attach it. I'm actually going to be attaching to the side of the pinch pot like this. So it's a little bit different. So just like we did before, I'm going to score and slip, and I'm actually going to mark it. That way I know exactly where I'm going to do that at. And then score. And then this time, we're going to press it on the side, apply some pressure. It's okay if the clay thins out a little bit, just try to keep it, even. And then I'm going to push this thing because I like the way that looks. I like the silhouette. And then I'm going to take some of this away so I can see what it looks like. And then on this back side here, I'm just going to make sure it's really nice and smooth. Now because my clay is wet enough, I don't need to add a coil at this seam. But sometimes if your clay is a little bit more dry, you would have to score this seam, add a coil, and smooth it out. And then if you have any cracks or anything, go ahead and smooth those out. You can use your fingertips or your brush, whatever you fancy. And then I'm going to move on to the next foot, which I'm going to put this one here. I'm going to go ahead and mark this. And then this one here. Okay, so once again, I am going to make sure your curl is going outward. I mean, I guess it could go inward, but this is going to help support your pot. So again, I'm just kind of gently pinching this to get a beveled edge or an angled edge. You kind of naturally get this shape that's occurring when we attached it. Try to keep it straight though. Now notice when I put this one on at first, I had it kind of angled like that. So that's not what you want. So if that starts to happen, just kind of move it so it's actually standing up straight, or else your pot's going to be uneven. Now that all my legs are attached, I'm not going to do anything to the base of these quite yet because they need to stiffen up, because you can see they're really moist and wobbly, and all we would end up doing is probably tearing them or squishing them down. So we're actually going to leave this one on its rim and let that one set up. And we will come back to all of these after they've set up for a little bit and had a chance to dry, and if you want to, you can add just a little bit more detail to them.